I'd like to welcome Richard Sanders, Claire Scarborough and Will Jones from the NHS South Central and West CSU. I'd also ask you all to pray hard to the internet gods, please, as all three of them are going to attempt to deliver their session today. And we're going to be treated to a talk that explains how FME has been used to analyse the viability of giving us all access to extended access GP hubs outside of normal working hours. So over to you guys, and thanks very much.
Okay, just to introduce, my name is Rich Sanders. I work for South Central and West in Bristol, which we're part of the NHS. We basically provide sort of data, business intelligence and solutions for all kinds of NHS partners. One of whom is NHS England. And something we'd like to talk to you about is where we work with them on looking at the National GP Extended Access Review, and which is something that we couldn't have done at this scale without FME. So we want to tell you something about the work and something about how FME's helped. So having failed with the prompt, I hadn't turned on my webcam. Sorry, I'm partly being shy and partly forgot. But first slide shows you us three from SCW. There's me in the middle, Rich. And to my left and right are my colleagues Claire and Will, who'll be speaking later. We're all analysts with. So sorry, say hi, Claire and Will.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Sorry. We're all GI and mapping analysts within SCW. We're a team of 11. We think we're probably the biggest GIS team within the NHS. And we've been using FME for a few years, but that's kind of really grown as the team's grown, and it's been an excellent platform for scaling stuff up and sharing ideas and just learning within the team. So it's worked well for us, and we want to explain something about a big project we've done. So as I said, we work for various organisations within the NHS. NHS England, which has regional offices and a central office, are one, and they're the guys that allowed us to work on our first national project on dentistry. And on the strength of that, we've ended up with other projects. We also very frequently work with national bodies called, regional bodies called clinical commissioning groups, which of course we've heard of inside our little world, and you guys probably haven't. But I'll show you what those look like on a map a little bit later. So the work we did with NHS England, sort of last year and going on to this, is about GP practices. So imagine back in the old days before COVID-19, if you wanted to see a GP, you either made an appointment or you waited in an open surgery. However, most GP practices, like this is my GP practice, sort of probably like 400 meters away from where I'm sitting now at home. They tend to keep fairly sort of business hours, so 8:30 till 6:30, a little bit outside 9 to 5, but kind of fairly normal business hours. The issue with this is that it can be frustrating for people who are either got busy lives or disordered lives to get access to a GP. So people might miss out on the care they need, or in frustration they might wait until it's got bad, or if it escalates, they might visit an emergency service. So they might end up at something like an NHS walk-in centre, or maybe even A&E. Now, basically, this is bad. This is called inappropriate access. If you've fallen off a ladder and you cut your leg and you're bleeding, you need to go to A&E. Fair enough. However, if you've been having migraines or you're depressed or you've got sort of chronic pain, something that you need to go and see your GP. You don't need to go to A&E. So this inappropriate access is not providing the right care. It's also very costly because, as we all know, A&Es are sort of absolutely, they're running at capacity a lot of the time. So it's important that the NHS works hard to try and keep the heat off A&Es. So something that's been done about it is trying to extend access to GP practices. So if I kind of unblur my slide about my local GP practices opening times, you can see that outside the regular opening times, they've got some extended opening hours. So sort of early in the morning on Monday, Tuesday evening, nothing on Wednesday, into the evening on Thursday. You can maybe see a GP or a nurse. So what's this called is where a GP practice can sign up to become an extended access hub. And the idea is that this gives people a bit more flexibility when it comes to getting access to primary care. So primary care is what you call where you just turn up basically for non-emergency stuff. So your GPs and your dentists and your pharmacists, that sort of thing. So in this case, GPs. So this isn't a new service, but it is emerging. More and more practices are signing up to become extended access hubs, and the public are, gradually finding out about it bit by bit. So NHS England, who sort of make a lot of the funding decisions about all this, had a whole load of questions about how GP extended access hubs are working. So they wanted to know how are they distributed across the country. NHS England work in terms of regions. They're quite similar to the old government office regions, if you were familiar with those. They make sense: southwest, southeast London, east of England, Midlands, northwest, northeast of Yorkshire. So they wanted to know, basic questions like how they're distributed across the NHS England region. And you could possibly do that with a spreadsheet and some adding, but GIS helps definitely. Then also how many per clinical commissioning group. So these are the more local organisations, about the size of local authority districts or counties. Sometimes they're exactly the same size. So they wanted things broken down by CCG, clinical commissioning group. And then they were also interested in a new landscape that's hit the world of primary care, called primary care networks. Some of you might have heard this outside the world of the NHS, but it's basically GP practices working together in little teams. So several practices working together. So they're serving a population of about 30 to 50,000. So they're sort of working groups, but they've just developed in the last year, and they're just four, possibly 4 practices were working together. They didn't really have territories. No one could really say very much about them until we sort of stepped in and did a lot of work using FME actually. So they basically had a ton of questions about their extended access hubs, starting off with things like what are these primary care networks? They wanted to know travel analysis. So for who are these hubs? How far do people have to travel to get to these hubs? Is it different in different areas? Presumably they're quite close in London, but presumably they're quite far away. And for some people living in rural Cumbria or Cornwall, but they need some figures for this. With this access, that's great. But what happens if they're not open 7 days a week? How do you account for that? And then we did our first lot of travel analysis with driving by private car, which is fair enough. But then they wanted to know about, can you do this whole massive analysis again with public transport? And even questions like, where are all the A&Es, walking centres and MIUs? There isn't just like a database. Surprisingly, there isn't just a database we can turn on. So we've had all kinds of questions put to us, which we've used FME for very effectively. I don't think we could have cracked these questions. We could have done them on a small scale with, the old-fashioned way with map info and spreadsheets and stuff, but scale it up to this level and it just becomes impossible. So hence we've used FME. So this is my little introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Claire and Will, who will give you a bit of detail about some of the work we did around the extended access hub. So over to you, Claire and Will.
Thank you very much, Rich. So yeah, we're going to focus on just one specific kind of part of the work we did. So we're kind of investigating the population's access to these sites. So just to give a quick, brief overview, here is a screenshot of kind of the majority of the southwest region, and you can kind of see the spread of these extended access hub sites and the NHS Type 134, which kind of mainly A&E, but there's a few of the NHS services as well, in the like minor injury units and walk-in centres as well. Yeah, so Claire's now going to take you through some of the FME process we used.
So kind of looking at the workbench that we used, as Rich mentioned, we're going to focus on just one part of really the questions that we answered with FME. Taking the population of England, the registered GP population, what kind of travel zones do they fall inside for the extended access hubs and the A&Es? Taking into consideration both of those, which is closer, getting to a hub or getting to an A&E, because that's kind of the one that you're more likely to go to. If you're injured and you've got an emergency, you're likely to go to your closest. And how does this relate and differ between different geographies? The Southwest is much more rural than the Midlands, for example, so it's not really a one-size-fits-all. So if we take a look at the workbench on the right, just trying to advance the slides. The first part is which travel zone do the population fall inside? So this workbench takes the GP registered population, which is a very large data set, and then it brings in some travel analysis that we did for the extended access hubs and the A&Es, It relates with spatial relator the population to its travel zone, so gives it kind of a value for I'm 5 minutes away from a hub, or I'm 15 minutes away from an A&E, for example. And then you want to bring in the different NHS geographies. So as Rich mentioned, from the biggest region down to primary care network level, because we'd like to know these statistics at all these different scales. And then spatially relate again these population points that know their travel access to their different NHS geographies. So really where FME was invaluable here was we had a massive data set of 6 million population postcodes, which actually represents about 60 million people. So that's really big and held in a database. The process is really repeatable. It takes this same kind of application and does it 5 times for each of the geographies, the travel zones. It combines many different types of data sets, so boundaries, the points. We actually had another workbench, an API caller, which got us the A&Es from an NHS website, which is actually quite hard to get hold of a full definitive list, and had to fix the geometry on that one using FME. And related to that, someone else could pick up the project. FME is great for leaving notes and a record of exactly what was done in the analysis, and kind of taking elements from one and sharing it with another. And related to that, again, what exact record of analysis was done, and for us, a timestamp of what was used. The population might look very different in December and January, for example. So for repeatability and accountability of what we've done, we had a really good record of exactly what we've done. I'll hand back over to Will, who'll look at the kind of outputs to that first stage.
So yeah, so just a bit of a context, this is an area we focus in the southwest. You kind of got your Padstow up here, you got Newquay over here in the west, and kind of Truro down in the south. So it's kind of the central area of the southwest. So this next slide, when it turns up, there we go. So this is basically showing all those postcode points that Claire mentioned, and for each postcode point, it's been kind of themed based on their public journey time to access the services. This map in particular is looking at the journey time to reach an EA hub at 7 PM on a Wednesday. And you can kind of see on the side here the legend, so it starts with a dark green for kind of 0 to 5 minutes, all the way up to a dark red, which is kind of 55 to 60 minutes. We actually ran isochrones all the way up to 4 hours, and those black dots kind of represent those travel times which take between an hour and 4 hours. Just to point out, we do not advocate you sitting on a bus for 4 hours to access these services, so might be worth getting a taxi if it's a bit urgent. Also, we were keen to see which postcode points were inaccessible to reach a service by public transport. So these white dots here you'll see are the postcode points which didn't actually overlap any of the isochrones, so it is deemed inaccessible to reach an EA hub site on Wednesday using public transport. As Claire kind of alluded to earlier, we then repeated this on multiple occasions. So we did the exact same process, running it across this time over the Sunday isochrones at 11. And the reason behind this was due to the different kind of schedules of buses, trains, water taxis even throughout the week. NHS England were very keen to see the impact the weekend, in particular Sunday, had on services, because services like buses and trains are obviously heavily reduced on the weekend and sometimes non-existent. So just here on the next slide is a quick comparison between the two. You can see on Sunday the number of points which are inaccessible increases quite a bit. So you can understand why NHS England was so keen to look at this. So yes, please limit your dangerous activities to Wednesday if possible, so you get better access. And then, as we kind of said earlier, we repeated this for the NHS Type 1, 3, 4 services, and again on a Sunday, Wednesday at 7, and also on the next slide you've got the Sunday at 11. There we go. And pass it back over to Claire to show from this output the second stage of our process.
So taking into consideration everything that we know about access, it'd be good to know kind of what decision making is going to get made by that population, which is actually closer, and categorising the population in that way. So in stage 2, the first thing we take is the population from the first part, who know which travel zone they fall inside for an A&E and a hub. Then the next step is a numerical test, because they got given a value. So you might be 5 minutes from a hub or 15 minutes from an A&E. In that case, the hub would win, and you give it the attribute of I'm closer to a hub. And then the next stage is, because we've got 60 million people here, and to look at these statistics at a high level for decision making, it's best to aggregate these up to all the different geographies, so from small to PCN, right up to region, to compare and contrast how these hubs are doing in the different areas. And then finally, outputting multiple sheets. They wanted a Excel spreadsheet output for this particular one, and Will can carry on and tell you a bit more about the outputs that we made.
Oh, it's gone too far. There we go, back to where we were. So AS, the output from the second kind of stage kind of use the same postcode points, but as Claire just alluded to, that we kind of looked at which one was closer. So you can see now you've got the same postcode points, but coloured 4 different ways. You've got your red for the ones that are closer to a type 134, your blue dots where those postcodes are closer to an ear hub, and green where they're equal distance. And then you've currently still got the white ones, which are inaccessible to both centres. And they're kind of clustered as you can expect. So you've got a hospital type 134 down here, and you've got a lot of red dots close to the centre there. And then similarly over here, you've got a blue, and a load of blue dots near the ear hub. So yeah, that's how it kind of works. We then also repeated this Sunday, just to see then for NHS England to see the number of people who were close to each site. But they were very keen to see the raw numbers behind the map. So what we did was then we aggregated those numbers up from the postcode level all the way to region level, and this shows the number of people who fell within each category. It was quite promising to see that on a Wednesday, 86% of the southwest population were closer to an ear hub, or at least equidistant to a type 134. So hopefully patients will kind of think twice about putting strain and disproportionate costs on A&E services for inappropriate access. Maybe think about travelling a shorter distance with a shorter wait time, with a reduced cost in NHS, and ultimately receiving the same advice as at an AEA hub. As I mentioned kind of earlier, the accessibility was a lot better on a weekday compared to Sunday. And NHS England were keen to look at the inaccessible numbers. So as you can see from the spreadsheet, the number of inaccessible patients kind of rose from a 4.2% all the way up to 18.6. So it's going from 250,000 to over 1 million people. And there's questions now, is anything that could be done to reduce this number? Working at that kind of level is not very useful though. So we also aggregated it up to CCG level. And then we kind of even fine-tune that. We looked at PCN level, where it's much more useful to kind of do strategic planning to target certain areas.
And just as a final slide to kind of emphasise that this honestly wouldn't have been possible without FME, we did the first round of analysis with the 3 different categories, region, CCG, PCN. We did it by driving, and NHS England came back and said, that's really great, that's been really useful, we want to explore it more. How about, does that change with off-peak drive time? How about, does that change with public transport? Can you run it again? And we could take the workbench that we'd already created and kind of tailor it to the new travel analysis and just use the same again. And then they wanted to delve further into the 2 different time periods, as Will's mentioned, comparing it by different regions. So it just meant that that process that took the time to build once was really, really valuable in the long run. I think that's the end from us. Unless there is any questions from anyone.
Thank you, guys. There's a couple of questions. I think actually probably one of them has just been answered by that last slide, but one of the questions was, have you rolled this out to other regions other than the Southwest? And are there other similar teams to yourself in other regions? But
shall I answer that?
Yeah, go on, Rich.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been done. This has been done nationally. We just tend to focus on looking at the southwest because it's it's our home turf, and we're experienced at we can validate things quickly. So, for example, when we were looking for the complete list of A&Es and walk-in centres, looking at the southwest really helped us look at it and go, oh, hang on, Musgrove Park Hospital's missing because it's the A&E that's closest to our boss, for example. So we tend to focus on that just for sort of validation, but the majority of this work was done nationally. In terms of other teams, we're not aware of that many GIS teams. We have done a bit of work with Esri recently, who are very aware of the number of GIS teams nationally, and we're keen to kind of reach out and coordinate a little bit in terms of other people doing GIS in the country. But I think we think we're probably the biggest GIS team in the NHS. So.
Okay,
yeah.
so we've just had a question in, basically letting you know that was very impressive. So so that's great. And is there an equivalent Welsh team to yourselves? Are you aware?
I don't know. That's it. I mean, I've got an ex-colleague who now works for Public Health Wales, and he's done some work with some GIS. But in terms of a direct team, I don't know, I'm afraid. That really interesting question. You'd think we'd know more about our close contacts. I mean, the work with our work is kind of, it's pretty much England only. We don't do any work in Wales, and we don't do any work in Scotland at the moment.
But
my boss Travis just letting me know about.
Yeah, so there is a Welsh Assembly who support healthcare there. So yeah, I'd be keen to kind of see what other people are doing and share knowledge there.
Okay, and the only other one was predominantly, what was the main output format that you delivered your analysis in?
So the main output, they were very much focused on the numbers, so just raw numbers behind it. So the majority of it was statistical spreadsheets, but we kind of had some of those kind of visual aids because we are kind of predominantly a mapping team, so we understand the visual behind things. It helps us understand it. So we created those alongside the main spreadsheet outputs, which was what they were after.
Yeah, the feedback we had was that the sort of national and regional level stats were very useful for the kind of policy makers and decision makers, and then it was the actual when you zoom down to the granular level, the actual primary care networks, like few practices at a time, that's more for the sort of operational decisions on the ground. So, but for both of those, they were very interested in sort of spreadsheet output, actual raw numbers.
And we got some great feedback that it kind of highlighted there was a few primary care networks that didn't have a hub, for example, and that's something that they could look into when they wouldn't have otherwise spotted that, looking at national scale.
I'm going to throw one last one at you, and then we'll say thank you very much. But did the patient data need a lot of data cleanse prior to doing the analysis?
So that, no, I mean, it's one of the data sets we actually rely on. Every month we get a refresh of who is registered to a GP in England, which is, it's an exceptional data set. It's almost like a monthly census, and the data quality is actually very, very good. We get it every month, and we found it to be really reliable. So that was one piece of data that that didn't need much work prior to the analysis. However, so much of it, it's a fair bit of heavy lifting once you've got it.
And probably the most challenging data set there was the A&Es and minor injury units, getting a full list of those, which was the API caller that someone in the team used, and fixing kind of the geometry on the map as well of those points was probably the most challenging data set there.
Yeah, I mean, there was plenty of data cleansing on the way as well. We got the sort of audit data about which hubs are coming open. That had been assembled from regions around the country, and that was a bit of a mess before we got started. So don't worry, we did have plenty of data cleansing to do. It wasn't a straightforward plug in and play piece of work. So there were challenges along the way, certainly.
Superb. Well, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. Excellent. And we're going to switch gears now a little bit, but thanks to everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you, Dave.